to a Hope 1032 podcast.
As followers of Jesus, in whom all things were made, we acknowledge the Darug people as the traditional custodians of the country of where this podcast is recorded. We acknowledge their continuing connection to the land and waters, and thank them for protecting this land and its ecosystems since time immemorial. We pay our respects to elders past, present and future, and we extend that respect to all First Nations peoples listening today.
Hope Book Club with Georgia and Simone. Because life's just better with a book.
Hi, I'm Georgia.
And I'm Simone.
And welcome to episode 65 of the Hope Book Club podcast, where we chat about books from a hope-filled Christian lens. And we hope this podcast makes you think, makes you laugh, and most of all, makes you read. This episode, we are delving into a book that we had so much fun talking about with those who attended our book club live event in July. It is, of course, the hugely popular Lessons in Chemistry by Bonnie Garmus. We loved it so much and people were so upset that they missed the live and wanted to weigh in. So we thought we would do a full episode and review on the book so people can listen back later. Lessons in Chemistry, if you don't already know, is about Elizabeth Zott, a chemist who is not your average woman. It's the early 1960s and her all-male team at Hastings Research Institute take a very unscientific view of equality. Except for one, Calvin Evans, the lonely, brilliant, Nobel Prize-nominated grudge holder who falls in love with, of all things, Elizabeth's mind. But like science, life doesn't always follow a straight line. She ends up reluctantly the host of an afternoon cooking show in which she starts to teach much more through the chemistry of food to the women of the nation, sparking big reactions from both men and women around the country. I loved this book so much, Simone. I know you liked it too. Tell us a little bit about the author Bonnie Garmus, because she is a very interesting lady.
She really is. So Bonnie Garmus is a copywriter and creative director. She's worked previously in fields of technology, like in medicine and education. Just quite a wide range.
Yeah.
She's an open water swimmer and rower, and I think the love of the later of that, the rowing, is definitely shown in this book. She was born in California and most recently from Seattle, but now she lives in London with her husband and her dog 99.
Quite an interesting name.
It is. I think that the inspiration was definitely found in that book as well. What I found the most interesting, though, about her was what she said about the inspiration of this book. So spoke to ABC RN's Big Weekend of Books. And she said it's not that unusual for women, including herself as an American copywriter and creative director, to still find themselves in a situation where they're in a meeting or they might be the only woman in the room and they either talked over, ignored, or in her case, had their ideas stolen and claimed by somebody else. And so she recalled being in a meeting like that when she left the meeting. After defending her ideas and herself, she was so upset, she went back to her desk and instead of working, wrote the first chapter of Lessons in Chemistry.
Yeah, and I think that is an absolutely amazing full circle moment and really plays into the whole theme of this book. Let's get straight into the positives. Simone, what did you love about this book?
Oh, there was so much to love about this book. Honestly, it's hard to pick a few things, but I tried to pare it down to three. My top three is the way that she kind of delved into different types of women in that era and their relationships with each other. Even the adversarial ones kind of were born out of this lack of freedom and equality that they had just being women.
You could almost tell, even the ones that you hated, right? You could see where they were coming from and you could see that the oppression, the suffering that they were feeling as part of the system they were in.
You could absolutely see even a lot of their reactions were just because of the situation they were in. And, sometimes I think, would we really react any different? I think for some of us, we probably would react the same. So I loved that. And then I also loved how Elizabeth's interaction with the rowing community showed just how beneficial community can be. And it even helped her with her relationships sort of outside of rowing as well. And I loved the way that got woven through. And then I think the thing that I loved the most and that I kind of identified maybe with the most was the irony of Elizabeth raising a daughter who was as curious and independent as her, but then in a different way. So she struggled with how, her daughter would react to things differently because she was different, even though she raised her to be the same in that independence. There was still a different way of that kind of coming out and the irony that kind of came with that.
Yeah, it shows that you can be raised in what you think is a similar environment and people can react completely differently. And I think, her daughter, Maddie, it was such a growth for Elizabeth. Like that was the turning point in which I think, began to kind of let go of the control, the rigid way that she held her life as well as a scientist, as children do, right?
Absolutely.
For me, I loved, again, so much about this book. I think I speak pretty much with the masses saying it's a really fantastic book, one of the best of the last few years. As a scientist, as a person with a science degree, I loved the depiction of that industry in the 50s and 60s. So different to what it is now. Obviously, just the blatant sexism is so rife and just the way that women were treated was absolutely horrendous. But I think you still see the subtlety of that in science today, especially in like research settings, which are highly academic and still like really there's not a lot of women leaders. They're still the main kind of scientists, the leaders and the professors are men. So I think just reflecting on that for me was really interesting. I loved that Elizabeth, through her cooking show, carved out a space for mothers in that demographic. The famous line at the end of the cooking show was, "Kids, go set the table, your mother needs a minute," basically. And I think Elizabeth realized that being a mother, they were the most overlooked demographic and still are to a degree. Mothers, amazing, unsung heroes of the world. But she spoke about it. She called it out. And I think for the first time for many women, she was the reason that mothers saw themselves as more than mothers.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
I agree. And I love that it wasn't just carving out for mothers. It was carving out a space for mothers to be more than mothers.
Yeah, brilliant. I also really love some of the side characters. I think just need special mention. The dog, 630, obviously stems from Bonnie Garmus's real dog, 99. I think there's some similarities there. But also the men in the novel that were close to Elizabeth were really great role models. You've obviously got Calvin, but you've got Elizabeth's boss at the TV show as well. They were supportive of her, but they didn't try and overshadow her, which was a really nice surprise, I think. It was really cool. So this book was set in the late 50s, early 60s. It's important to understand what that time was like, and we get a glimpse of it. But the time was supposedly progressive, right? Man was getting ready to walk on the moon. Scientific progressions were happening everywhere. But when you look at this from a women's perspective, they had been pushed out of jobs that they had to do. They were replacing the men in World War II. They came back, basically pushed back to the house. So they had this taste of freedom. It was pulled back from them. This was the kind of setting that women were in at the moment. How much did you relate to not only Elizabeth's experience of the book, but the author's depiction of women's experiences?
Yeah, so for this book for me was obviously not being in that time, like not being anywhere near that. Like, you know, I don't know those, but I see a lot of my nan and my mum in this book. So it's set in the same time frame that my nan actually became suddenly a single mum and ended up having to work in mine sites in Papua New Guinea, which is a very male-dominated space, with my mum and my aunt. And my mum is honestly so much like Mad. Like she is the way that she thinks and talks is what my mum was like at that age. And so I found myself constantly remembering stories that my nan and my mum would have told me from that era, like while I was reading the book. It was fascinating even talking to my mum afterwards, and she read it as well, and just kind of being like, oh my gosh, like these situations, these things. And she really identified with a lot of those moments because for her, she lived them.
Yeah.
And she saw my nan living them. And so although I didn't, I couldn't relate to those stories, I definitely had those moments and those memories of the stories of my mum and my nan coming back constantly. And it sort of was like when I have those moments with my nan and my mum, we're talking about those stories and those conversations. The situations, I can't sit there and be like, I know what that was like or exactly, but each situation, every experience tends to have a moment where I'm like, I've experienced something similar. It's just this generation's version of it. And so I could still see the feelings and the frustrations, and the struggles, and the experience, the ultimate experience of it was still there, even if the situation was different.
Yeah, the setting. Yeah.
The setting was different. And so for me, like the casual sexism was huge. The trying to pit women against each other are still those issues for me that I really identified with. And I know you'll talk about it more with your degree, but I studied film, which is still fairly male dominated. And that feeling of constantly having to prove yourself in a way and prove your knowledge was definitely still there. The casual sexism of that, which you saw Elizabeth constantly having to reiterate, I'm and prove herself constantly. And I think another one that we can all experience with this is areas that you might be in. So I'm a huge F1 fan, right? Massive, love basketball, love F1. Again, there's still heavily male dominated areas. And, Elizabeth's experience with rowing just kind of kept reminding me of similar experiences that I've been seeing women coming up through F1 having, where, Elizabeth had to almost prove she was better than the men to be able to be given the same opportunities. And you see that constantly still in today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, I just basically want to reiterate everything you're saying. I definitely felt that with my degree. It was still very much not 50-50 participation in STEM. We're trying, but still a very male-dominated field. I did some research in my undergrad degree and was under the most incredible woman who is an absolute leader in her field, has been for decades. But, when she wasn't in the room, there was this, it was the subtle, it wasn't even comments, it was the unconscious kind of bias of the men in the room, and the jokes that when you call them out, they're like, oh, well, didn't mean it like that. It's like, yeah, but don't say it. That's the thing. So there is still work to be done. And I think, just reflecting on that was definitely a big part of the book for me. But also I did see a lot of my mum and my grandmother in this book as well. My grandma was quite a bit older. She was born in the Great Depression, so she was like in her 40s, 50s, kind of when this book was set. But my mum was the youngest of four, so my grandma had my mum when she was 45, and she was a working woman, and that was unheard of the time, but it was what was done. And she was a secretary to a lawyer, and she jumped on the train every day, and she was a typist, an amazingly fast typist, but she experienced, again, that sexism. So it really kind of made me understand their experiences a little better as well, which was really cool. In the book, obviously rowing is a metaphor for how Elizabeth sees a better society. It's not only an outlet for her stress, but it's kind of this utopia she sees, how society could be. No one person in the boat is more important than the other. Everyone has to play their part. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman or whatever. Have you ever participated in anything, whether that's work, sports, community, where everyone must, I guess, row as one to succeed, where that teamwork is required to, I guess, make it work? And if you have, do you think that should be prioritized as something that we all do in our lives?
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely, as a kid, I played netball and basketball, dance, theatre groups, all of that. Having worked now sort of in community radio even, or in church non-for-profit groups, been involved in a lot of different groups. And you have to row as one, but I think you also have to experience ups and downs together. And that makes a huge difference, learning how to process that as a group and being able to go forwards together in a way that is going to actually be beneficial to everyone in that group. And I think that's really important to learn as well with part of this. It's the rowing together as a community, but also learning as part of that how to deal with those things that don't go right, the ups, the downs, the losses, and not let it tear you apart, to kind of keep going together and keep rowing and keep going so you can win the next time, so that you can bounce back. And I think that's something that's really important. And I think a lot of different community groups and sport and, theatre, dance, all of those different things that you do as a group together help teach that, and it's so important.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's a disproportionate emphasis on sport in Australia, which I don't think is always healthy for people that aren't athletically inclined or interested in sport, shall we say. But I do believe that my participation in team sport as a kid, netball especially, completely shaped the way that I interact with others and the way I problem solve and the way you're resilient, because you're right. You have to rely on others for a common goal. And I think that is so important. So whether, your kid doesn't have to be, or as kids, we don't have to be in team sport, but I believe that team activities that are beyond school are so, so important to have those outlets, whether that's theatre, whether that's dance, whether that's, volunteering or something. After I left school, was a first responder for St. John Ambulance for about 7 years, and was absolutely the best thing I could do, because apart from, obviously learning first aid and being comfortable around like medical emergencies, which is always helpful, you have to rely on others. And it's so important. I don't think that's something that we should lose or ever stop doing throughout our lives. So important to have those outlets, definitely. All right, I think this book, we have talked a lot about Elizabeth and how amazing she is and how amazing the women are in this book. I think this book also includes some really fantastic male characters who are sympathetic to Elizabeth's plight. And yet, Calvin and Dr. Mason, they have trouble standing up for Elizabeth. They have trouble standing up for women in their lives, in their workplaces, other minorities. Why? Why do you think that is? Why do people that have their hearts in the right place often have such a hard time speaking up?
I mean, I think it can be so difficult. Like, you don't want to say the wrong thing. You don't want to look like an idiot. I feel like it can be hard if you feel like you might be rejected for it, or you might start an argument. Like, I struggle with that kind of confrontation and rejection thing. So I can, thank my ADHD for that. It's one of those moments that, the consequences can feel so huge that they almost feel like too big. And the consequences of speaking up even on little things can suddenly can feel like they're massive, like they're, a huge mountain. But I just kind of feel like you can never underestimate the power of making someone feel like they're not alone in those difficult situations. So even speaking up in a little way. And I try to remember two things when I'm in situations like that. And I don't always get it right. But those two things are, if you're speaking with good intentions, willing to listen and open to changing your opinion or your mind when presented with new facts, then you're standing up with someone with a degree of empathy. And it's really hard to kind of get that wrong. It's hard to kind of be rejected by people or to look like a fool or an idiot if you approach it in that way. Because ultimately, even if you do get it wrong, if you're approaching it and doing it that way,
with an open heart.
The heart shines through, and you can, take on board anything. And the second thing I try and remember is that if ultimately you get rejected or there's confrontation from it, it's them, it's not you. It's, to take that away from the person who is getting upset. If you've done it with good heart and good intentions, you've done everything you can. That's all you can do. And what will come from that will come from that.
Yeah. And,
I think it is something that this book is so good at, I think, reminding us to do, is to step out, to take those moments. I recommended the book to a friend, and she called me soon after she read it to tell me about how she was at a community thing that she's involved in, and she heard some sexist remarks from some of the older guys in the group, and where she would have just let it slide in the past, she was inspired by the book to just go, I'm not sure, that's really appropriate to be saying, and kind of just stood up. And there was no one else around that might hear that or be offended by that or whatever, except for herself. But she knew that if she stood up and just politely and nicely went, no, actually that's not okay to say, that it might stop them from saying it to someone else in the future.
Yeah, and also other people around might have been uncomfortable. You never know. That's the thing. I think that's brilliant. Thank you for those suggestions. Simone, finally, before we wrap up, did you have a favourite character, favourite moment, favourite quote? Go.
So 6:30 was the dog.
The dog
was absolutely my favourite character. I feel like he was often the eyes for the reader in the story. It was like you could put yourself in, he was watching it all kind of happen. And this comment from him, for me, just sums up the hopefulness that the book ending had. And it's, say what you want about the human race, their capacity for kindness was what, in 630's opinion, put them over the top species-wise.
That's big coming from a dog.
How about you?
That's really sweet. Mine has to come from Elizabeth herself. And she was talking, I think, about, I can't remember exactly where this quote is from. I'm pretty sure when she was asked why she wears a pencil in her hair. And she says, a pencil instead of a pen, you ask, because unlike ink, graphite is erasable. People make mistakes, Mr. Roth. A pencil allows one to clear the mistake and move on. Scientists expect mistakes, and because of it, we embrace failure. And I think that was just brilliant. Elizabeth failed so many times in her career, in her, personal life with what she would seen as failures, and she just kept going and kept going. And I think that's a brilliant message of the book.
Yeah, same.
We would love for you to be a part of our community. If you loved this episode, we have so many bookish related conversations in the Hope Book Club Facebook group. And also, we're actually going to be having one live over Zoom on the 29th of November, which is a Wednesday evening. We have our final live event for the year. We're going to be reviewing The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart by Holly Ringland. It's just been made into a series on Amazon Prime. I'm pretty sure the book is from 2018, so it's been out for a few years. But you don't have to have read it to come along, by the way. There's going to be no spoilers. You can head to our website to register, hope1032.com.au. You'll get the Zoom link there, and you can also register for a little treat that we might send out to you before the event as well. All that information is, of course, in the show notes, as well as the link to our Facebook group. We would also love this podcast to reach more people, and the way you can help us do that is to rate, review, subscribe. And as Simone said, as she shared the book with one of her friends, you can share this episode with a friend who might really love to hear it. We will catch you next time. Sim, a quote to end on, please.
Yeah, so from Margaret Fuller, an American journalist who was the first female war correspondent, she says, "Today a reader, tomorrow a leader."
Catch you next time.
Hope 1032. Thanks for listening.